In Boston, Massachusetts, Christian Gerhard Schreider on trial for kidnapping, assault and battery, and lying about his identity to police. Even his wife of 12 years thought he was a member of the prestigious Rockefeller family. That courtroom is now dark, closing arguments this morning, and now jury out deliberating. And we want to ask our guests what they think the fallout of this case will be as we wait for the verdict to come down. And out in Boston, Massachusetts, criminal defense attorney Geoffrey Nathan. And we should note that Mr. Nathan also represents Daryl Hopkins, remember, the limo driver who unknowingly helped Clark Rockefeller run away with his daughter, which gets me right to you, Mr. Nathan. How did this guy fool so many people for so long?
He fooled them because he was good. My client's interactions with Clark Rockefeller, I call him, were brief and few, but basically the whole story came out in the few rides that my client had given. My client's perceptions of Rockefeller, I call him, his ability to perceive whether or not he was insane or not, were related to Geoffrey Denner prior to the trial. I granted Mr. Denner an opportunity to question him, and it basically came out during pretrial interview that my client just fell for everything like everyone else in the city of Boston did.
Because why would you not believe him, really, when you think about it? Of course, you have no reason to suspect that someone is making up an entire identity. Why would they, really? And if you go about suspecting that kind of thing from top to bottom in your life, well, you'll be very busy Googling everyone you meet. Now, as we wait for these verdicts to come down, we've been taking a listen to the closing arguments in the Rockefeller case, the last thing the jury will have to consider. Let's jump out to our guest in Boston, Massachusetts. So pleased to be joined by Geoffrey Nathan. Of course, Geoffrey Nathan represents Daryl Hopkins, the livery driver who found himself just caught up in this mess, yet another innocent victim of this defendant. There's really not a question that he lied about who he was. The real question is whether he's too mentally ill to be held accountable. And Geoffrey, I want to ask you to put on your criminal defense attorney hat for a moment and answer not specifically as Mr. Hopkins' lawyer, but just as a man who practices criminal defense work in Boston. You have to get on your feet for that last time in front of the jury. You don't have the benefit, as I did in my practicing state of California, you don't have the benefit of hearing the prosecution's argument first, so you're pretty much out there on your own. What's the most important thing in this case for these defense attorneys to convey to this Boston jury? Insanity is a very, very hard thing. It's a very difficult defense, and it rarely works.
Indeed, it rarely works, and what you have to do, and I think the defense did it in this case, which was to just say, please be open-minded, consider the evidence which you've heard, and they attempted to narrow down in their closing arguments to the fine points of what, where the prosecution's expert failed and why the prosecution's expert cannot be believed. The reason is he has no experience, and at least the defense expert is experienced. And a lot of experts have contradictory opinions in substantial criminal cases, such as this one. But my word, I was surprised that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts couldn't have found someone that had testified in a courthouse before. I mean, that is really a shocker.
Yeah.
I think Denner did very well, Jamie. I have to say, he really shredded the Commonwealth's witness, and I think that's a good reason why we might see an NGI, not guilty by reason of insanity.
Yeah, or at least one or two of the jurors who want to go that way, which would result in a hung jury, quite possibly. And I share your surprise, Geoffrey, that they called James Chu. He was a very affable witness, but not an experienced one. And in the meantime, you got Keith Abloh and Dr. Howe, and whatever you might think of them, very, very well-qualified witnesses. Let's listen to a little more with that little preview from our guest in the field, Mr. Nathan. Let's listen to a little more of his colleague there in Massachusetts. This is defense attorney Geoffrey Denner, and he's making his closing argument just a little while ago to a Boston, Massachusetts jury.
America's criminal justice system is one of the greatest strengths.
This is The Best Defense. I'm Jamie Floyd. Earlier today, we heard closing arguments in the case against Kristen Gerhardt Schreider, and soon a Massachusetts jury will have to decide if he's culpable in assault and battery, using a false identity, and kidnapping his daughter. Her nickname is Snooks. So in the meantime, as we wait for the jury to come back with a verdict, let's take a minute to look at the jurors in the box. We know there are 7 men and 9 women. Most are either college students or recent graduates, but some of the occupations range from firefighter, Harvard professor, and therapist. Let me jump out to our guest in the field who practices there in Massachusetts, Geoffrey Nathan. And Geoffrey, we also know there's an engineer and a surveyor on the jury in our New Jersey case, another case that we're covering, and that's become a big issue because their math and the amount of distance covered is very important. Now, a judge can say, look, you're not to bring things that you know about this case or your own personal knowledge into the jury room. But how realistic is that? Aren't they going to get back there and start talking about the Rockefeller family and bringing their own sense of being faked out by people they may have known over the years into that deliberations room? Don't we ask jurors to do a whole lot, which is just not humanly possible?
It is my experience that jurors bring into their room their life's experience. It just can't be helped. They're picked by both the prosecution and the defense in the hopes that they will simply evaluate the evidence and make a decision, guilty or not. But in reality, what happens, the court bailiffs, the guys in the white shirts, they're the ones that come to us later and say, this is really what I think happened, or I heard such and such, and it's really invaluable because we get to know in the end what jurors were persuasive to others. And in fact, many jurisdictions allow a polling of the jury. You really find out why. But I think in this instance, we've got there was a smart jury pool, and they're going to bring their life's work to bear.
Yeah, and I got to say, ever since a jury was willing to let those accused in the Boston massacre essentially off the hook at a time when that kind of a verdict was horribly unpopular, I got to think jurors in Boston and in Massachusetts in general are pretty open-minded, and they understand the presumption of innocence and the burden of proof perhaps better than anywhere else in the country. Out in Boston, Massachusetts, criminal defense attorney Geoffrey Nathan. And Mr. Nathan, of course, represents Daryl Hopkins. He's that limo driver who got sucked into this whole mess, helped Rockefeller drive away with his daughter. And I guess I'll come out to you first, Geoff Nathan, because we wanted originally to have you on just real quickly to talk about this particular individual, your client, who was so deeply affected in this case. But then we realized, heck, you're a practicing criminal defense attorney. Let's have you for the full 2 hours. So let's take advantage of that expertise, that experience, and let's talk a little bit about the law of insanity. It's a very, very difficult burden to meet. And even though the defense in your home state of Massachusetts doesn't have an affirmative burden, as they do in other jurisdictions, it's still hard to prove it up in a court of law. Now, this guy clearly has something wrong with him. And the prosecution even mentions, acknowledges, admits in its closing there's something wrong with this guy. So why isn't he insane as a matter of law? What's the disconnect, Geoffrey Nathan, between crazy, what we generally refer to as crazy as lay people, and the legal requirements for insanity?
Well, the legal requirements for insanity are so difficult in Massachusetts that rarely is it used, and even rarer is it successful. And when you have somebody who's as functional as Rockefeller was, the defense really has a tough burden to prove. I mean, let's face it, here's a man, as David Deacon, the prosecutor, said, who was living high on the hog in Massachusetts and had all the elements of success. And so a jury is going to say to themselves, wait a minute, the judge has instructed me that I have to find beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant didn't know the difference between right and wrong, or because of mental disease or defect couldn't conform his actions. I mean, all this complicated language. What? Are you kidding me? And look at him right there. He's well dressed. He seems to be behaving himself. Therefore, I think that what's going to happen is we're going to have a message sent by this jury fairly quickly, and it may be a thumping found guilty. What the defense wants is a not guilty by reason of insanity, which means the defendant would be shipped out to Bridgewater, and he served a sentence at our state mental hospital.
And this
That's
is
all.
a very important point. A lot of people have this misconception that if you're not guilty by reason of insanity, you're not guilty, and you're going to walk out a free man.
Right.
Far from it. In fact, in California, the mental health facilities when I practiced, and this was a while back, were so horrible, often you wouldn't raise the defense because you thought jail or prison would be better for your guy than the mental health facility.
Well,
let me bring it. You know these cynical strategy calls we make as defense attorneys. Let me bring Edgar De Leon and Dan Agnew. I'm Jamie Floyd. This is The Best Defense. Verdict watch in 2 courtrooms around the country, one in New Jersey, one in Massachusetts. And I want to jump out to Massachusetts, where our new friend, Geoffrey Nathan, joins us. He's a criminal defense attorney, also happens to represent one of the witnesses in this case, Mr. Darrell Hopkins, who had a very small role in this mess. He was duped into driving this defendant a short distance during the alleged kidnapping. And I'm not going to ask you the obvious question, which is how could your guy fall for this, because I think it's become very clear that a whole lot of people did over a long period of time believe that this defendant was in fact Clark Rockefeller. But here's my question for you, asking you to be both a criminal defense attorney but also as the man who represents this witness. It seems that people like Mr. Hopkins and the ex-wife, Sandra Boss, and so many others could be victims, and that still this defendant could be not guilty by reason of insanity. In other words, the fact that all these folks were victimized by this falsehood over this many period of years doesn't necessarily mean he's culpable in criminal court.
Well, and you might have 12 jurors say the exact same thing. So hopefully his luck will continue. I certainly should say that the legal community in which he partially also ingratiated himself was surprised when the truth of who he really was came out. So let's face the music here. It wasn't just my client, as you said. A lot of people, a lot of smart people were conned by this man. And here in Boston, we think we're kind of smart, but a lot of people were just dumb. So that happens. I mean, let's face the music here. He should have been a bank robber. He would have gotten a lot more money than the $800,000 he got out of Boss.
I'll tell you something, Geoffrey Nathan. Around the country, we think you're pretty smart, too, there in Boston, Massachusetts. All right, we're going to...
I hope so.
We do. The seat of the country's history. And really, I think, in many ways, the way in which we practice the law, and criminal law in particular, started there in Boston. So it's really quite an honor to be inside this courtroom. Let's take you back in as we wait for the verdict to come down more in the closing argument. Let's jump out to the man who's seated right there in that jurisdiction. You know these juries better than anyone. What's the best defense? Geoffrey Nathan.
Well, yes, thank you. You could have tried this, that you can't kidnap your own child. That wasn't something that this defense team went with, but his prior lawyer was using that balloon in the Boston Globe right when this case broke.
Yeah.
So we don't know. I haven't researched that myself, but that could have been tried. Other than that, you could have gone with an NGI on all indictments. But that's unlikely. But I think they did what they could do with a tough set of facts into them. And you know, that's one thing is you have to do is you just play the cards that are dealt to you.
I was just going to use exactly that phrase. You play the cards you're dealt. That's exactly right. And we'll find out soon enough whether they've played the hand well, because the verdict watch continues, and we're going to continue to monitor both courtrooms. A very big thank you to our guests, Edgar De Leon and Dan Agnew here in New York, and our new and good friend, Geoffrey Nathan, out there in Boston, Massachusetts. Thanks, gentlemen, to all of you.